Loris is related to Loris from way back, so all sorts of connections there. But no, I count it a privilege to be with you this morning. When I was praying earlier for you, there was a verse that I felt that God had for you as a people this morning to encourage you in who you really are. And it was 1 Peter 2:9. But you are a chosen people, a royal priesthood, a holy nation, God's special possession, that you may declare the praises of him who called you out of darkness into his wonderful light. Can we pray? Thank you, Lord God, for this time, this place, for your people. And I want to ask this morning that you would receive all the glory that you deserve, and that your people will be inspired and encouraged to tell the world what you've done. Amen. Shall we get into it? So I'm representing a global organisation called Creation Ministries International, which exists to build the faith of Christians, to give them confidence in God's Word, the Bible, and to encourage them in sharing their faith with others. We describe this as arming God's army, and we're effectively an information ministry to the church. And we focus on the book of Genesis at the beginning of the church because that's the book most under attack by those who are seeking to discredit the Bible. The greatest weapon in that attack has been the theory of evolution. So this morning I want to look at three things. Firstly, to show you why this issue does actually matter. Secondly, we'll look at some evidence supporting the creation account in the Bible. And thirdly, we'll look at what we can do to make a difference. Now, a warning up front. This talk is not intended just to tickle your ears or stimulate you intellectually. It's intended to result in action. You have been warned. A little bit about me. In case you haven't guessed it already, I'm fully convinced that creation of the universe occurred exactly as described in the Bible, in the book of Genesis. And personally, I found the evidence and support of that to be absolutely overwhelming. But I know that not everyone will necessarily hold that same view right now, and that's fine. We're all on a journey here. But for me, it was really, really exciting when I began to discover that science had not disproved the Bible and actually supports what's written in it. All it took was access to good information. So I want to encourage you this morning to keep investigating, keep learning, keep questioning. That doesn't indicate a lack of faith. It's actually a very healthy thing. Jesus encouraged lifelong learning. In Matthew 22, when he was asked, which is the greatest commandment in the law? He replied, love the Lord your God with all your heart, with all your soul, and with all your mind. And there's no shortage of useful information around. There's a wide variety of resources available here today. And I just want to emphasize that Creation Ministries is a not-for-profit ministry. We're primarily donations funded, and we want these resources to be as accessible as possible for you. Now, I really love science, but I'm not a scientist. I have no scientific qualifications beyond year 13 physics and chemistry. But what I've found is that you don't need to be a scientist to understand this issue. You just need to be equipped with the information. So while not formally trained as a scientist, I've been an avid user of science, particularly physics, in a context where getting it wrong can have very serious consequences. I'm referring to my involvement in aviation, which includes the maintenance of big aeroplanes, specifically jet engines, as an aircraft engineer for nearly 39 years, and flying small ones as a hobby for a bit less than that. Now, flying is an amazing privilege, which allowed me to do some really fun things like this. Now, stalling an aircraft is very different to stalling a car. It can result in a spin, which unnerves some passengers because you end up pointing straight at the ground, going round and round. But it's a perfectly safe manoeuvre if it's carried out at altitude. And that was on purpose, by the way. Now, flying comes with a warning. It's highly addictive. Linda will tell you that I spend way too much time looking skyward and wishing I was up there. But up there isn't always a good place to be. There is a truism in aviation that says it's better to be down here wishing you were up there than to be up there wishing you were down here. And it's very true. The chances are, if you find yourself up there wishing you were down here, it's because of something you didn't do or didn't know before you even took off. It's highly likely that you weren't prepared or equipped in some way. And I want to suggest that the same is true for all of us here today. We need to be prepared and equipped ahead of time. We all have conversations, hopefully, where people raise questions about Christianity and the Bible. How do you go when you're in that position? The Apostle Peter in the Bible has some advice for us in this regard, where he tells us to always be prepared to give an answer to everyone who asks you to give the reason for the hope that you have. How well prepared are you? What will you say when your teenager comes home and says, "We learnt all about evolution at school today and how it works"? Or when your workmate says, "How can you deny evolution? The fossil record proves it." Or your neighbour might say, "How can there be a loving God when there's so much suffering in the world?" Will you stammer something unconvincing and wish you were down there, not up here? Or will you respond intelligently and coherently? These are great opportunities to have a real impact in someone's life. I want to tell you that it's possible to give solid answers that make sense, that cause non-Christian people to think, maybe it's not all myth and wishful thinking after all. Maybe I should find out more. All you need is to get your hands on the right information, and you'll find that there are sensible answers to virtually every question or objection. So the first reason that the creation versus evolution issue matters is that we need to be prepared for conversations around this topic. We need to be able to defend our faith. Not only so that we can feel more confident, but better than that, that we can be fruitful and effective. We've been called to be salt and light in our world, and we're surrounded by lost people in desperate need of help and direction. Second reason that this discussion matters is that the Bible is under attack. Now, the theory of evolution is the greatest and most successful attack on the Bible there has ever been. And we read daily about the tragic results of abandoning the biblical worldview. Now, some, even in the church, think that the creation-evolution debate is a side issue. It's not worth focusing on. But I want to tell you that for those outside the church looking in, it is not a side issue at all, and it's very much what they're focused on. Evolution is the greatest reason given by people outside the church why they don't believe the Bible. And you may be surprised to learn that this issue affects the core message of the Bible, salvation, Jesus' death on the cross, as we'll see later. So don't let anyone tell you that this is a side issue. Another reason that this is important, I have a question for you. Where did you come from? I want to suggest to you that when you boil it all down, you could say there are three really big questions that we all face regarding our time here on this planet. The ultimate questions of life, if you like. Question number one, where did I come from? What's my origin? Question number two, why am I here? What's my purpose in life? And question number three, where am I going next? Or what happens when I die? And I also want to suggest to you that your answers to questions 2 and 3 depend entirely on how you answer question 1. If life started randomly and we evolved with no creator, then your time on this planet has no meaning, no ultimate purpose, and when you die, that's it. End of story, job done. Our children are taught this worldview, and then we wonder why the youth suicide rate is so high. In my opinion, it's tragic, but unsurprising. Following the Columbine High School massacre in 1999, the school superintendent asked why such an atrocity had occurred. Pastor and police chaplain Gino Geraci gave the following reply. He said, "You have taught our children that they come from nowhere, that that's where they're going, and that life is a point of pain in a meaningless existence. And they believed you. Am I drawing an unwarranted connection here between evolutionary thinking and horrific acts of violence? I don't think so. Creation Ministries' article at the time highlighted how one of the killers wore a t-shirt emblazoned with natural selection, and that both young men were obsessed with Darwinism and Nazism. Our young people are not stupid. If we tell them that they're nothing more than rearranged pond scum, then they'll come to the entirely logical conclusion that they have no more value than pond scum, and they will act accordingly. The evolution issue matters. It's not just an interesting intellectual discussion. Lives really are at stake. Ideas have consequences, and bad ideas have bad consequences. I found the following tongue-in-cheek definition. Life, a sexually transmitted disease which always ends in death. There is currently no known cure. But arguably, the question, where did I come from, is the most important question that we can ask. A little girl was facing this question, so she asked her father, where did the human race come from? Her father answered, well, God made Adam and Eve. They had children, their children had children, and all humans are descended from them. 2 days later, the little girl asked her mother the same question, but her mother replied, well, many years ago, the human race evolved from monkeys. The confused girl returned to her father and said, Dad, I don't get it. You told me that God created the human race. Mum says we evolved from monkeys. And her father wisely answered, well, dear, it's very simple. I told you about my side of the family, and your mother told you about hers. Obviously, not a real story, but if you were that father, could you give logical answers to your daughter supporting your statement that God created humans with solid evidence? It really could impact her eternity. So can you see how our answer to the question, where did I come from, does matter? Now, in case you're still not convinced that this issue matters, I've got some sobering information for you regarding our young people going off to university. Now, you need to understand that university is actually far from neutral. Virtually every subject is toxic to Christianity. Australian Students for Christ chaplain Craig Tasker noted, the institution's philosophy of education is secular humanism. Thus, students are bombarded with it in every lecture as the basic assumption. This constant brainwashing destroys the faith of many Christians each year. He says our surveys indicate that 80% of first-year students believe in a God who is there. By their second year, only 15% believe in God. Fallout is a powerful DVD produced by Creation Ministries in which uni students in the USA were interviewed about the teaching they received as a young person. Every single student who said they were raised in the church but now no longer attends church said they believed evolution to be a scientific fact. And the interviews showed clearly that the majority of young people not exposed to creation teaching in their youth now embrace evolution and no longer attend church. Yet, listen to this, every student spoken to who was equipped with answers about evolution as a young person still retains their Christian convictions, in spite of the evolutionary teaching they received in higher education. Better still, every single student spoken to who affirmed biblical creation still attends church regularly. It's a powerful DVD. I'll tell you later on how you can get hold of a free copy. So having established that this issue is important, how can we get prepared to respond to questions and challenges? How can we equip our families? Probably the easiest way is the free InfoBytes email newsletter produced by Creation Ministries. These regular emails keep you right up to date with the latest information and news. Now, when I say that it's free, in the original Hebrew, that means you don't pay anything at all. And InfoBytes is not limited to science-related topics, but addresses all sorts of recent news and topical issues. It's a great resource that costs you nothing. So if you'd like a regular supply of encouraging articles and biblical perspectives on the latest discoveries, please just add your details to the sign-up sheet that will circulate now. If you can add the postcode, that helps us to tailor the information by area, and your phone number helps if the email address is illegible. It's that easy. You're on the journey. You're getting equipped to make a difference. The other free resource is the Creation Ministries website. Now the web address couldn't be much easier to remember. It's creation.com. The amount of information you'll find there is staggering. At creation.com you'll find around 10,000 articles covering everything imaginable on the creation evolution debate, as well as many articles supporting the Bible as God's Word. Around 700 video clips, many just as short as a minute long, and a new front page article every day, Monday through Saturday. A teenage schoolgirl found she never had answers to her questions, but after finding our website, she says, "I was surprised to find the answers to the questions I had been asking for over 10 years in literally the first day I was at your site. It helped me realise that true faith and intelligence aren't mutually exclusive. A few months later, I became a Christian." How awesome is that? It's the power of being informed. So, just so that we're clear on what we're talking about here this morning, I'm going to define the two histories that claim to tell us how we got to where we are now. The predominant view, popularised in almost all media and educational systems, tells us that it all started with a large bang, where nothing exploded and became everything. The earth, the universe and all things came into their present form by a slow, gradual process of self-transformation with no designer or creator. Life originated spontaneously, and life forms gradually progressed from simple single-celled organisms to increasingly complex animals, culminating in you. Death and suffering have always been part of the process of biological improvement, according to this view. On the other hand, according to the Bible, the universe was brought into being by God as a one-off supernatural process, resulting in a complete, functioning and balanced whole. Creation was initially very good or perfect, with no death, disease, pain or suffering. God created plants and animals and people able to reproduce only within their own kind, and humans were designed with purpose and created fully formed, intelligent and creative. After the fall, where Adam and Eve disregarded the only restriction they were given by God, the whole of creation was judged. Sin, death, disease and suffering entered the picture for the first time. Since then, the whole universe has been winding down or descending into a state of increasing disorder. As a result of the sinfulness of people, God judged the planet with a global flood which destroyed all land-dwelling vertebrate animals and people, except those on board a ship the size of an ocean liner built by Noah. And later, when the descendants of the Ark survivors refused God's instruction to spread out and repopulate the whole earth, God introduced different languages among them, which forced them to move away from each other at the Tower of Babel. Now, I've got a couple of scale models of the Ark that we can pass around, just to give you some idea of the size and the shape. At the church I was at last week, I brought my Ark models along, but then saw they had a massive 2-metre one sitting at the back of their church, so I quietly put mine away. So having defined the two competing histories, you'll note that one of the most obvious differences between them is the time frames. Evolutionary history is completely harnessed to huge time frames, and it requires gradual change over millions of years. The biblical time frame, on the other hand, is much shorter. The book of Genesis tells us that God completed his work of creating in 6 earth rotation days. Now, of course, if he is who he says he is, he could have done it in 6 seconds or instantly. But he chose to do it over 6 days. The writer of Genesis makes this crystal clear and really leaves no room for any alternative time frame. And 6 normal days also makes sense of Genesis as the basis for our working week, as described in Exodus 20. It's worth noting that these verses are part of the 10 Commandments, and as such, these are words spoken directly by God. The Bible also gives us a timeline of world history, around 1650 years from creation until Noah's flood, and then about 4,500 years since then. So how does the Bible do this? Well, genealogies can be added to give us about 2,000 years from Adam until Abraham. Remember all those begats in the Bible you used to read when you were having trouble sleeping? Turns out they're there for a reason. Who'd have thought? So that gets us from Adam to Abraham. Then the Old Testament gives us enough detail about the reigns of kings and major events in the history of Israel to be able to calculate another 2,000 years until Jesus, and finally about 2,019 years since then. So where did the idea of millions of years of Earth history come from? Well, people looked at the huge depth of sedimentary layers in the Earth's crust and assumed that the layers must have been laid down gradually, which would, of course, take a long time under normal circumstances. But could the layers have been laid down rapidly? Well, Noah's flood gives us a mechanism where massive sedimentary layers would have been laid down all over the Earth in a relatively short space of time. And we have modern evidence of exactly this happening, albeit on a much smaller scale. We have actually observed rapid formation of sedimentary layers. When Mount St. Helens in the USA erupted on the 18th of May 1980, one of the many surprising results was an 8-metre thick sedimentary deposit exposed in a cliff alongside the North Fork Turtle River. It's composed of finely layered sediment, and if we didn't know better, could assume that it had been laid down layer by layer over long periods of time, except we know that this whole deposit formed in just 3 hours because it was observed. The Mount St. Helens eruption also demonstrated how canyons can be formed much faster than conventionally thought. The ongoing eruptions eroded the thick sediment dumped at the base of the volcano, producing channels and canyons. One of these channels, named Little Grand Canyon, had sidewalls up to 40 metres high and a small stream running through it. Now, someone seeing that canyon might conclude that it was eroded slowly by the small creek over many hundreds or thousands of years. However, the formation of this canyon was documented. It was carved by a mudflow in a single day on the 19th of March 1982. So the creek did not cause the canyon. The canyon caused the creek. Other canyons on the flanks of the volcano show that it's not just softer material that can be eroded really quickly. Lewitt Canyon, which is over 30 metres deep, was gouged in part through old, hard volcanic rock called andesite by mudflows in just a few months in the second half of 1980. So we have plenty of evidence that sedimentary layers can form quickly and can be eroded very quickly also. The real Grand Canyon is another amazing example where we can clearly see the various rock layers. You may not be aware, it's powerful evidence for rapid deposition of sedimentary rock. See how the lines between the layers are very flat and sharp. Now these supposedly represent gaps in time of millions of years. But think about it. If those surfaces had in fact been exposed for millions of years before the next one was laid down, they would not be flat at all. They'd be heavily eroded by weather, tree roots, animal burrows and so on. This picture shows the sharp, flat contact line between the Coconino sandstone above and the Hermit Shale below. There is supposed to be a 10 million year interval between these two layers of the Grand Canyon. But this contact can be seen extending for hundreds of kilometres with no sign of erosion between the layers. This is strong evidence they were laid down rapidly. So while the idea of the Earth being around 6,000 years old may seem radical when we've been constantly bombarded with millions of years, in fact, the majority of the scientific evidence indicates that the Earth is young, not millions of years old at all. So we've already looked at some of the geological evidence supporting the creation account in the Bible. Before we look at some more evidence, I need to explain something about science. not all types of science are equal. When most people think of science, they think of what we call operational science. Now, operational or experimental science, it's measurable, it's repeatable, there are well-defined laws that accurately predict outcomes. There's not much debate about this type of science, and it's the sort of science that builds cell phones, rockets, microwave ovens. Generally speaking, operational science provides us with lots of beneficial technologies, and it leads people to respect what scientists say. But when we talk about evolution or anything that happened in the past, it's not operational science. What we're dealing with here is historical or forensic science. It's not really repeatable or measurable because we weren't there. We can't repeat the Big Bang as an experiment or the spontaneous origin of life. We don't know the exact conditions or environment. We should remember what God said to Job in Job 38:4. Where were you when I laid the foundations of the earth? Some evidence will be available to us today, but it will be interpreted by a human. Both evolution and creation fall into this second category. So to reiterate, operational science deals with the present, it's observable, repeatable. This is the sort of science that underpins aviation, where there's no place for speculation or philosophical influences. It has to work. Note also that no one has ever found a conflict between the Bible and experimentation in operational science. Historical science, on the other hand, which is what we're discussing today, it deals with the past. It's not observable or repeatable. This is an important distinction to make. This is also where worldviews really come into play. This explains why there can be such different explanations for the same evidence. Both evolutionists and creationists are observing exactly the same data or evidence, but coming to very different conclusions because of their different worldviews. One more thing about science. Science is investigative by nature. Ideas change as we learn more. Now, this isn't necessarily a bad thing. This is how it should be. But God's Word doesn't change. It never has, it never will. It doesn't need to change because it's true. So never be tempted to place scientific thought above God's Word. So let's take a look at some more evidence. Firstly, is there much evidence for the origin and diversity of life? Well, evolution and creation both make big claims. We would expect there to be masses of evidence available supporting the correct history. And there is. There is so much scientific evidence supporting the creation account. And the Creation Ministry's resources are full of literally hundreds of examples of this. The number and breadth is increasing all the time. This is an exciting time to be a Christian. We're going to look at just a couple of examples. First up, fossils. Now, fossils are presented as evidence for evolution, but actually fossils give fantastic support to the Bible's history. Let's look at how fossils are formed. The story that we've probably all been told and that you'll find with a quick Google search is that an animal dies in or ends up in a body of water where it sinks to the bottom. Over millions of years it's gradually covered by layers of sediment. Eventually it becomes a fossil, which may be discovered when the sedimentary rock erodes away. Does that sound reasonable? It does, until you think about what happens in real life. In real life, a dead animal in a marine environment doesn't just sit there untouched for years while sediment gradually covers it up. It's immediately set upon by the local carnivore club, who tear it apart and scatter the remains. It certainly does not remain in one piece long enough for sediment to cover it. And recent experiments have shown that even in the absence of predators, a body in water will disintegrate rather than remain in one piece. In reality, the only way to create a fossil is complete and rapid burial of the dead animal, excluding oxygen and preventing carnivores from making a meal of it. Now, we find millions of fossils all over the world in rock laid down by water. Can you think of a historical event that might explain the rapid and complete burial of millions of animals all over the earth? Relax, it's not a trick question. The global flood of Noah's day provides the ideal explanation. Now you need to understand that Noah's flood wasn't just a benign raising of water levels after a lot of rain. This was an incredibly violent and catastrophic event. There was lots of volcanic and tectonic activity. It reshaped the surface of the whole planet. And there would have been sediment flows on a massive scale all over the earth, well able to drown, bury and fossilise millions of animals. Other pieces of evidence that support this explanation of drowning and rapid burial are fossils that appear like a snapshot in time, showing animals like this fish in the middle of eating its lunch, or giving birth, like this ichthyosaur. I've heard of long labours, but millions of years? Don't think so. This is not what you would expect from a slow and gradual process. Also of interest is the arched back posture of many fossils that we now know as evidence of death by drowning. We've got a real fossil to pass around this morning. It is a Phacops trilobite, which is an extinct marine arthropod. The detailed preservation of this specimen is evidence that it was rapidly buried before scavengers could munch on it. It was very likely fossilised during Noah's flood 4,500 years ago. So you can touch something that was very likely walking around as Noah loaded up the ark. There are many other ways in which the fossil record supports the Bible's version of events. The next piece of evidence I want to look at is genetics and mutations in particular. Now this is another area where the two histories are completely opposed. According to the evolutionary version, we have evolved uphill from simple life forms to more complex, so we're supposedly getting better over long periods of time. The Bible, however, indicates that at the very beginning, Adam and Eve were genetically pure. After they disobeyed God and the whole of creation was cursed, mutations began to increase to the point where now around 100 additional mutations are added per person every generation. So what are mutations? Mutations are changes in our DNA, and they're most commonly errors that occur when our DNA is being copied. Mutations are not good. They're responsible for thousands of inherited diseases and cancer. So if we inherit 100 new mutations every generation, as well as the existing mutations already present in our family line, we're not improving. We're going downhill. The modern discovery of genetic entropy, that we are carrying an ever-increasing number of mutations, is exactly the opposite of the evolutionary story, but it aligns perfectly with the Bible, which tells us that our genetic golden age was in the past, at the beginning. We're now degrading or going downhill. And we see this as the number of mutations increases in each successive generation. So if you're a fan of shows like X-Men, I'm sorry to break it to you, mutations don't give us superpowers. They give us diseases. Very disappointing for some. This is also powerful evidence for the shorter biblical time frame. At the rate mutations are increasing in us, the human race would have become extinct many times over if we had in fact been around for 1 million years. Evolutionary geneticist Alexei Kondrashov asked, why aren't we dead 100 times over? And this overall downward trend is also strongly supported by the second law of thermodynamics. And if you want to know more about that one, have a look on creation.com or ask afterwards at the tables. There is so much more evidence available in all the scientific disciplines that supports the Bible's history. As I said before, if you want to see lots more evidence like this, check out the resources when we finish. Or go to creation.com, you'll be amazed at the wealth of information available there. I hope you're beginning to see that armed with a bit of information, a few key concepts, it's very easy for you to get equipped with the answers to the commonly asked questions about creation and evolution. Speaking of having good answers to the commonly asked questions, remember what I said earlier about the two histories being very different with respect to the time frames. A universe 6,000 years old versus 14 billion years old. 6 days versus millions of years for all life to develop. The numbers are not even close. Now, some people try to fit millions of years into the Genesis account. Has anyone heard of ideas like each day in Genesis represents millions of years? We looked earlier at some of the geological evidences for a young Earth, but there are also theological problems with the idea of millions of years of Earth history. Firstly, there is nothing in the language of Genesis that suggests or even allows that interpretation. People sometimes make the point that the Bible contains many varied writing styles. There's poetry, songs, symbolic, letters, prophecy, and so on. That's true. But the writing style of the early chapters of Genesis is very clearly literal narrative or history. Another significant issue is the sequence of events. First, the Bible tells us in Romans chapter 5 that the first appearance of death is only after Adam and Eve rebel against God. Prior to that, there is no death, sickness, no disease, a world that is totally good. In any millions of years scenario, however, death and suffering are there from the very beginning, part of the creative process, and certainly part of the picture before Adam and Eve appear. So if we accept the evolutionary time frame, we end up with this image of a supposedly very good Garden of Eden sitting on top of a fossil record depicting death and suffering. Secondly, in the evolutionary version, mankind appears near the end of history. In the biblical version, mankind is there at the beginning. The third issue with accepting evolution in millions of years is the damage done to major themes of the Bible. Now, this is where we discover that this is not just an Old Testament issue. Take note, this will be new for some of you. If we accept evolution in millions of years, we are in effect saying that Jesus was mistaken when he said, "But at the beginning of creation, God made them male and female," in Mark 10:6. Remember how in the evolutionary version, people only appear near the end of history. Jesus said they were there at the beginning. The Apostle Paul must also have been in error when he said, "For Adam was formed first, then Eve," in 1 Timothy 2:13. Even the linchpin of Christianity, Jesus' death and resurrection, no longer makes any sense if death wasn't the result of Adam's disobedience. Let me explain this. The Bible is very clear that sin appeared and impacted the whole of creation because of the actions of one man, Adam. Romans 5:12 describes this. Therefore, just as sin entered the world through one man, and death through sin. The Bible then describes a parallel process where the actions of one man, Jesus, described as the last Adam, was able to reverse the effects of sin on all mankind. Romans 5:18. Consequently, just as one trespass resulted in condemnation for all people, so also one righteous act resulted in justification and life for all people. And 1 Corinthians 15:22 says, "For as in Adam all die, so in Christ will all be made alive." This makes no sense if there was death, disease and suffering before Adam sinned. A further problem with accepting evolution in millions of years is that we have to accept that a supposedly good God used death and suffering as a creative process. So what we find is that any attempt to insert millions of years into the biblical narrative forces us to accept that Jesus was in error in what he said and that his death on the cross was pointless. Now please don't misunderstand me here. I'm not saying that accepting the biblical age of the earth is essential for people to be saved. But I really hope you can see that accepting evolution in millions of years brings us to a confused and contradictory history of the earth. But taking the book of Genesis as it is written gives us a logical and consistent worldview that we can defend against skeptical attack. So I want to ask again a really important question. Are you willing to get equipped so that you're able to respond to questions about your faith? Are you willing to equip your family with answers to the questions that we know come up all the time? Questions about carbon dating, dinosaurs, missing links, ape men, how did all the animals fit on the ark? Who was Cain's wife? How did the different races arise? How could a loving God allow suffering? People are looking for solid answers. There are far too many testimonies of people walking away from their faith because they couldn't get answers to these questions. And they were told, just believe. So back to Peter, who told us to always be prepared with answers. This is the reason that the Creation Ministry speakers lug around lots of books, DVDs, magazines and pamphlets. It's so that you can do your own investigating, so that you can get equipped, so that you can hear the side of the story you're not going to hear in most classrooms or on the Discovery Channel, so that you can hear from real scientists who have got real degrees from secular universities who have been involved in real research. Scientists who have found that the biblical history is by far the best fit in explaining our universe and everything in it. I want to reiterate, we're not selling resources to make money. We're a not-for-profit ministry. Primary aim of Creation Ministries is to help you get equipped with information and tools, able to show that God's Word is true and trustworthy. If I could borrow from a colleague and put this in culinary terms, I would suggest to you that this talk is nothing more than an appetizer. The main meal is over there. Don't underestimate the impact that you can have by getting hold of good information, digesting it and passing it on. There is a battle going on over the hearts and minds of our families and our friends. So stop for a moment and think, who in your world needs to hear this message? Who do you know that needs to be informed? Probably the most effective means to share this information is through Creation Magazine. I'm one of many people who would say that this magazine has literally changed my life. This powerful resource comes out 4 times per year. It's always visually stunning. It's suitable for a wide age range. There's always a kids section. It carries no paid advertising. It's completely full of useful information. It's a great way to keep informed about the latest issues and discoveries. And Creation Ministries receives many testimonies of the life-changing impact of this magazine. For example, a young scientist called Sonia had rejected Christianity, but a colleague both memorized and photocopied Creation Magazine articles and shared them for over 2 years. She says, the process was interesting in that once I realized that creation could have happened, thereby removing my evolutionary foundation and replacing it with the creation foundation, I then found it easy to accept the entire gospel message. By passing on a copy, or even subscribing for someone else, you could be instrumental in that kind of change in someone's life. How amazing would that be? Additionally, the hard copy subscription to Creation Magazine now includes the digital version, which you can access on up to 5 devices. No steak knives, I'm sorry. But wait, there is actually more. If you subscribe for 1 year, you'll get a free back issue, and a 3-year subscription will give you the free back issue and 2 sleeved DVDs. One is called Rapid Rocks, which gives lots of geological evidence for a global flood. The other is the Fallout DVD that I mentioned earlier about university and our young people leaving the church. This family magazine gives God the glory and gives you the answers to defend your faith. So there's another sign-up sheet going to circulate now for those who wish to receive Creation Magazine, and I really encourage you to do so if you don't already receive this amazing resource. Just fill out both parts of the sign-up sheet, tear off the stub and bring it to the resource table afterwards to collect your freebies. I'm not exaggerating when I describe this magazine as life-changing. Many people continue to testify to that. Next, I'll highlight just a few of the other resources available. Note we do have a small amount of slightly damaged stock available at half price today. Creation Ministries' most popular book is the Creation Answers book, which carries the answers to more than 60 of the most asked questions about creation, evolution, and the book of Genesis. All the different questions I listed before are answered in this resource, plus many more. In my opinion, this is a must for every coffee table. Great to have just sitting around as a handy go-to resource. Virtually every question that will be asked in a forum like this is already answered in the Creation Answers book, and pretty much any challenge thrown at you by a skeptic is covered in an understandable way. We carry child-friendly books as well. The Please Nana series include Please Nana, Who is God? And Please Nana, What is Death? These deal with difficult concepts in a child-friendly style. Next, Refuting Evolution is a powerful book that deals with the main arguments for evolution used in schools and universities. Now, maybe you have concerns about young people struggling to do well at school in evolutionary topics if they learn about biblical creation. What we find is actually the opposite. One of our speakers reports, a couple of years ago, a young Facebook friend commented that he had been reading creation stuff for years and that it was a lot of fun. Matthew went on to say, I've actually found that I'm acing biology, specifically evolution, because I seem to know more about it than my teachers. Matthew was excelling in his studies because he understood the scientific concepts. I hope you can see that exposure to this information really works, and it's not hard to find. The biblical explanation has such power, not just to explain what we see around us, but as people see that it makes sense, they're drawn towards Jesus and salvation. And ultimately, that's what it's all about. There are many DVDs as well covering topics like why is there so much suffering if God created a very good world? Dinosaurs, an amazing witnessing tool supporting the Bible. Biology, which I've personally found to be one of the most exciting areas. Geology, the earth is covered with evidence for Noah's flood. Astronomy, many more. Today is actually a great opportunity for you. These resources are not available in schools or libraries, not even in most Christian bookshops. And finally, another reminder about the website, creation.com. All of this has been produced so that you and your family can get informed, equipped, excited about the truth of the Bible, able to deal confidently with any questions that come your way. I'm living proof that you don't need to be a scientist to get a good understanding of these issues. People like you and I can really impact our culture. So to round it all off, I want to return to the three big questions we considered at the beginning. Where did I come from? Why am I here? Where am I going next? Remember how our answers to questions 2 and 3 depend on our answer to question 1. Well, if the Bible is correct, and what it tells us about question 1, that we were deliberately designed, created by an all-powerful, all-knowing, all-loving God, then it's only sensible that we look at questions 2 and 3 and consider, what does the Bible say about them? Regarding the question, why am I here? The Bible, which is described as a love letter from God, all the way through, tells us that God created us to be the recipients of His love, and that we were designed to love Him back and to know Him intimately, and to live a life of purpose, fulfillment, and excitement. Regarding the question, where am I going next? The Bible also gives us a very clear answer. Remember how good the world was before the entry of death and suffering brought on by sin? God promises restoration to a similar state, but even better, the complete removal of all pain, suffering, disease and death in a place of intense joy and peace in His close presence forever. Sounds amazing, doesn't it? Again, remember how Adam and Eve had the choice of obeying God and remaining in a perfectly good paradise, or rejecting Him and experiencing the pain and suffering that were never intended for them. We all face that same choice today. Jesus, when He died on the cross, reversed the effects of Adam's disobedience, and He made a way, the only way, for us to be reunited with God. The Bible describes how sin entered the world due to the actions of one man, the first Adam, and also how sin and death were defeated completely by the actions of one man, the last Adam, Jesus. We can't earn our way into heaven by being good. We'll never be good enough. We need to respond to Jesus. If this is something that you haven't done yet, I really encourage you to keep searching, keep asking, keep investigating. So to close, I want to suggest to you that the Bible is completely consistent with what we observe in the world around us. It is not opposed by science. It's true, and we can trust it with our lives. Returning once again to the challenge in 1 Peter 3 to always be prepared. This is so easy for us today. There is so much information. I really encourage you to have a look at the resources available here today. Take something away that you can digest at your leisure. Just don't forget the last part of 1 Peter 3 that counsels us to talk to people with gentleness and respect. This is such an exciting era for Christians, as more and more scientific discoveries are made that so powerfully support what God has said all along. Again, I encourage you, keep learning, keep getting better prepared to answer the questions and the challenges that will come your way. Don't be this guy. I'll be available afterwards if there are issues or questions you want to talk through, or if you prefer, talk to your church leadership. But asking questions is a really healthy habit. And if this has whetted your appetite, I regularly run an 8-week course where we look at these issues and many more in a bit more depth. Always be prepared. Thank you for listening. You made it.